When people think about violent crime, there's a picture that usually forms in their mind. It's loud, it's chaotic, and more often than not, it's male. But history tells a more complicated story. Across Canada, from quiet neighborhoods to ordinary homes, there are cases where the violence didn't look how anyone expected. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't explosive. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it was planned. And sometimes it came from people society is least prepared to suspect. Women who killed, women who deceived, women whose crimes weren't immediately visible, but devastating once uncovered. This documentary isn't about shock for the sake of shock. It's about understanding how these crimes happened, how they went unnoticed for so long, and why our assumptions about women and violence often leave blind spots in the justice system. Each case in this video is real. Each one was investigated, and every outcome left permanent damage behind. Before we begin, quick check-in with you. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it there? And honestly, what's the weather like? I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're into deep, well-researched true crime documentaries like this, go ahead and subscribe. More long-form stories like this are coming. Lila Young, 1930s and 40s, Nova Scotia. In a quiet fishing community called East Chester on the rocky south shore of Nova Scotia, a seemingly compassionate service operated from the late 1920s through the mid-1940s. It was called the Ideal Maternity Home, and to many families in the region it appeared to be a refuge, a place where young women who were pregnant and unmarried could go, give birth discreetly, and start anew. What happened there would later become one of the most disturbing and controversial chapters in Canadian history. At the center of this story was Lila Gladys Young, a trained midwife who had recently graduated from obstetrics school, and her husband, William Peach Young, an unordained minister associated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In 1928, in their late 20s, they opened what they called the Life and Health Sanitarium. Within a few years, they renamed it the Ideal Maternity Home, and its reputation began to grow, but not always for the right reasons. In a period when social stigma around unwed pregnancy was intense and support was limited, the Young's home offered discretion. Women from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and in some cases from the United States, came to give birth there. Many paid a steep fee for the service. At a time when average weekly wages were around $8, the Youngs charged as much as $500 for maternity care. Healthy infants were frequently placed up for adoption, often with wealthier couples from the U.S. reportedly for sums that could reach up to $10,000 per child. By today's standards, that amount seems astronomical, but at the time it was a sign of just how lucrative the business had become. And yet, for all the healthy births and seemingly joyful adoptions, there was another side to the story, a side marked by neglect, secrecy, and unanswered questions. Over the years, the home grew into the largest maternity facility of its kind in eastern Canada. At its height, it housed anywhere from 80 to more than 100 babies in its nursery, and an estimated 800 to 1,500 children were born there between 1928 and 1946. But beneath its prosperous surface, reports began to surface from health officials and former residents of the home that conditions were far from the ideal they claimed to offer. Medical professionals who examined the facility described nurseries that were overcrowded, fly-infested, and unsanitary. There were accounts that some infants were fed only molasses and water, that basic medical care was absent or insufficient, and that premature or sickly babies were left to deteriorate. These troubling reports were not just the result of rumors. In the mid-1930s, the Nova Scotia Department of Public Welfare began gathering evidence against the Youngs. They lacked the necessary legal frameworks of modern child welfare systems, but their investigations revealed practices that troubled officials, questionable medical care, unexplained infant deaths, and what appeared to be a highly commercial approach to adoption and child care. One of the most chilling revelations came years later when journalists, historians, and survivors began piecing together what had happened to children who were never adopted. In several locations near the home, workers found burial sites, shallow graves containing wooden grocery crates and butter boxes used as makeshift coffins for infants who had died or disappeared. It was these boxes that gave the story its haunting name, the Butterbox Babies. Accounts from those who survived or later researched the home suggest that babies who were sick, disabled, or otherwise considered unmarketable were often denied adequate care. Some were buried quietly in these boxes when they didn't survive. Witnesses later described how children who could not be placed for adoption were essentially left to wither away. At the time, the Youngs enjoyed considerable local support from prominent families, businessmen, and political figures, a factor that helped them contend. Operating despite mounting scrutiny. Social networks and reputations of doing good work for vulnerable women made it difficult for authorities to shut the home down outright. The Youngs did face legal challenges over the years. In 1935, they were convicted on charges of fraud for billing child care expenses for a child who had already died. In 1936, they faced charges of manslaughter related to the death of a mother and her newborn, but were acquitted. Over time, changes in adoption and welfare laws resulted in some convictions for breaching licensing requirements, but even then, they continued their operations under different names. The home's downfall, however, didn't come from traditional prosecution alone. In 1946, the Montreal Standard newspaper published an investigative article detailing allegations that the Youngs were exploiting expectant mothers, selling babies across borders, and operating with questionable medical practices. The Youngs sued the paper for defamation, a decision that backfired when testimony in court revealed the troubling conditions inside the home, including statements that dead infants had been buried in butter boxes. The jury dismissed the libel claim, effectively exposing the home's practices to public scrutiny. By 1947, the home was effectively shut down, and in the years that followed, provincial reforms to child welfare and adoption laws were enacted in part because of the controversy. Yet even decades later, many questions remain unanswered. The exact number of infants who died there can't be confirmed, and some family members continue to search for lost relatives whose early beginnings trace back to that small Nova Scotia home. In the decades since the home's closure, survivors and adoptees have come forward with a range of experiences, from grateful parents who found loving families to those who have spent a lifetime searching for their birth roots. Some have even gathered for reunions and memorial services, honoring both the children who survived and those who never came home. Public reaction at the time was a mix of shock and disbelief. Some were horrified to learn how unregulated adoption and maternity care could be exploited. Others struggled with the knowledge that stigma and lack of social support had enabled such a place to flourish. Today, the Butterbox Babies story stands not just as a historical scandal, but as a lesson in how societal pressures, secrecy, and lax oversight can combine with personal ambition to produce outcomes that ripple across narrations. And while no single figure like Lila Young represents every wrong in the system, her name is forever linked with one of the most painful chapters in Canada's social history. Evelyn Dick, 1946, Ontario. In December 1946, just before Christmas, a group of children were playing near the Hamilton Escarpment when they stumbled across something no one was prepared to see. Partially concealed in the brush were human remains, cut apart and scattered. Police were called immediately, and within hours, the area was sealed off. It didn't take long for investigators to realize this wasn't an accident or an animal attack. The remains had been deliberately dismembered. As detectives worked to identify the victim, the discovery sent a shockwave through Hamilton. This wasn't a remote area or an isolated town. This was a growing industrial city, and what had been found suggested something deeply personal and carefully done. The body was soon identified as John Dick, a well-known Hamilton pharmacist and businessman. He was married, financially comfortable, and known in social circles. On the surface, he appeared to be a man with a stable life. But the investigation would quickly show that his private world looked very different. Once John Dick was identified, attention shifted immediately to his wife, Evelyn Dick. Evelyn was striking, charismatic, and known for her flamboyant lifestyle. She moved easily through social scenes, dressed well, and had a reputation for living beyond her means. Behind that image, however, were growing debts, strained relationships, and a marriage that was quietly unraveling. Police searching the Dicks' home uncovered disturbing evidence. In the bathroom, investigators found signs that John's body had been cut apart inside the house, likely in the bathtub. There were traces of blood, tools that could be linked to dismemberment, and inconsistencies in Evelyn's account of her husband's disappearance. Even more troubling was the conclusion reached by the coroner. John Dick had not died naturally. Evidence suggested he had been poisoned, likely with arsenic, before his body was dismembered. This meant the killing happened first, followed by a calculated effort to dispose of the remains. From that point on, Evelyn Dick became the central figure in one of the most sensational criminal cases Ontario had ever seen. As police dug deeper, Evelyn's personal life came under intense scrutiny. Investigators uncovered a pattern of affairs, financial manipulation, and deception. Witnesses testified that she frequently borrowed money, wrote bad checks, and relied on different men to maintain her lifestyle. The portrait that emerged was not of a woman acting in panic, but someone comfortable living multiple versions of the truth at the same time. Evelyn was arrested and charged with murder. The trial began in 1947 and quickly became a media spectacle. Newspapers across Canada covered every detail, from Evelyn's appearance in court to the contents of her purse. Public fascination was intense, and opinions were sharply divided. The prosecution argued that Evelyn poisoned her husband for financial gain and then dismembered his body to avoid detection. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial and failed to conclusively prove who carried out the killing. At the time, forensic science was limited. While the case against Evelyn was strong in the public eye, the jury was instructed to focus strictly on what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. In the end, Evelyn Dick was acquitted of murder. The verdict stunned the public. Many believed justice had slipped through the cracks. But legally, the case was not over. Authorities continued to investigate related matters surrounding John Dick's death, particularly financial crimes and inconsistencies in Evelyn's statements. In 1949, Evelyn was tried again, this time on a lesser charge of manslaughter. This second case focused more narrowly on responsibility for John's death without requiring proof of premeditated intent. The jury reached a different conclusion. Evelyn Dick was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison. She served several years behind bars before being released on parole. For a brief moment, it appeared the case had finally reached its end. Not long after her release, Evelyn's name surfaced again, this time in connection with the death of an infant under her care. Years earlier, during the original investigation into John Dick's death, questions had been raised about the fate of the couple's baby son, Peter. The child had vanished from public records, and Evelyn's explanations were vague and inconsistent. No body was ever conclusively identified, and no clear documentation accounted for what happened to him. In the early 1950s, Evelyn was rearrested and charged in relation to another infant's death. The case once again drew public attention, reviving unanswered questions about her past. Although this later case did not result in a murder conviction, it reinforced the unsettling pattern that followed Evelyn throughout her life. Death seemed to appear wherever secrecy and control surrounded her. By this point, public sympathy had evaporated. Newspapers openly questioned how many times Evelyn Dick had slipped past full accountability. Editorials criticized the justice system's inability to deliver closure in cases involving vulnerable victims. For many Canadians, Evelyn had become a symbol of someone who understood how to manipulate perception and how to survive legal scrutiny. The Evelyn Dick case remains disturbing not because of unanswered forensic questions alone, but because of what was established. Evelyn Dick was never convicted of murder, yet she was legally found responsible for her husband's death. She served time, regained her freedom, and later found herself back in police custody, connected to another child's death. And then there is the question that has never been fully resolved. What happened to her infant son? No confirmed grave, no verified adoption record, no definitive explanation. That unresolved silence is what keeps this case alive decades later. A reminder that sometimes the most unsettling stories aren't the ones with dramatic endings, but the ones where the truth remains fragmented. Evelyn Dick didn't fit the image of violence people expected in 1940s Canada, and perhaps that's why she was able to evade full accountability for so long. In the history of Canadian crime, her case stands as one of control, deception, and unanswered loss, a story that still unsettles investigators, historians, and the public alike. Lulonda Lynn Flett, 2011, Winnipeg. In the early hours of January 25, 2011, a three-story rooming house on Yonge Street in Winnipeg, Manitoba, was quiet in the way shared housing often is at night. Most of the tenants were asleep. Some had just come home. Others had nowhere else to be and were simply trying to get through another winter night. That calm didn't last long. Just before 4 o'clock a.m., smoke began filling the building. Flames spread quickly, racing through hallways and stairwells that were already narrow and difficult to navigate. For many of the people inside, there was no clear way out. By the time emergency crews arrived, the structure was fully involved. Firefighters worked through heavy smoke and intense heat, but the damage had already been done. 5 people did not make it out alive. Those victims were adults who lived in the rooming house, a type of housing often used by people with limited income or unstable living situations. These were not strangers passing through. This was their home. Several others were injured, some seriously, and dozens were left displaced in the middle of winter. From the start, investigators suspected this was not an accident. When Winnipeg Fire Paramedic Service crews began examining the scene, they found multiple indicators that pointed away from an electrical fault or a heating issue. The fire had started in a specific area and spread in a way that suggested deliberate ignition. Fire investigators concluded that an accelerant had been used. That finding immediately shifted the case from a tragic fire to a criminal investigation. Winnipeg Police Service officers were brought in, and a homicide unit was assigned. When a fire results in death, and there's evidence it was set intentionally, the stakes change instantly. This wasn't about negligence, it was about intent. As investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to the fire, Lulonda Lynn Flett emerged as a central figure. Flett was familiar with the building and the people who lived there. According to court records and witness statements, she had been inside the rooming house shortly before the fire broke out. Surveillance footage from nearby locations placed her in the area around the critical time window. Witnesses later told police that tensions had been building in the days leading up to the fire. There were reports of arguments, frustration, and anger directed at people inside the house. None of it, on its own, explained what happened, but together it painted a picture of escalating hostility. Investigators also recovered physical evidence consistent with arson. Combined with the witness accounts and timeline analysis, police were able to narrow their focus. Within days, Flett was arrested. The 5 people who died were tenants of the rooming house. Their ages ranged from young adulthood to middle age. Some had family nearby. Others had limited support systems. What connected them wasn't just where they lived, but how little chance they had once the fire took hold. Rooming houses often have older construction, shared exits, and limited fire separation. When flames move fast in those conditions, escape becomes extremely difficult. Autopsies later confirmed that the victims died as a result of the fire and smoke exposure. There was no indication they were targeted individually. That fact would become central to how the crime was later understood in court. In 2012, Lulonda Lynn Flett made a decision that removed any ambiguity about responsibility. She pleaded guilty to 5 counts of manslaughter. Under Canadian law, a death caused by arson, can meet the threshold for first-degree murder if the act was intentional and showed a reckless disregard for human life. Prosecutors did not need to prove that Flett intended to end the lives of specific individuals, only that she knowingly set a fire in an occupied building, fully aware of the likely outcome. During court proceedings, the agreed statement of facts laid out a clear sequence of events. Flett deliberately ignited the fire, left the scene, and did not attempt to warn the occupants. The plea spared families from a lengthy trial, but it did not lessen the weight of what had happened. In January 2013, Flett was sentenced to life imprisonment. Under the sentence, she is not eligible to apply for parole for 7 years, the standard period for first-degree murder in Canada. The judge emphasized the severity of the crime, noting that setting a fire in a residential building placed everyone inside at immediate and unavoidable risk. The court also acknowledged the vulnerability of the victims. They were not people with multiple escape options or safety nets. They were asleep in their rooms when the fire began. The sentence ensured that Flett would remain in a federal penitentiary for decades. Public response in Winnipeg was swift and emotional. Community members held vigils near the site of the fire, leaving flowers and candles despite freezing temperatures. Advocacy groups renewed calls for better oversight of rooming houses and safer housing options for low-income residents. For many, the case underscored how quickly people living on the margins can be placed in danger, and how devastating the consequences can be when someone chooses violence in those spaces. What makes the Lulonda Lynn Flett case especially disturbing isn't complexity or mystery, it's clarity. This was not a chaotic situation that spiraled out of control. It was a decision made in advance, carried out in a setting where people were known to be sleeping, and followed by a deliberate departure from the scene. Arson in occupied buildings is uniquely lethal because it removes choice. The victims didn't have the option to run, to hide, or to defend themselves. Once the fire was set, the outcome was largely sealed. Flett didn't single out one person. She didn't confront anyone directly. Instead, she created a situation where 5 lives were lost without warning. That's why this case remains one of the most brutal examples of mass killing by arson in modern Canadian history, and why it continues to be cited in discussions about sentencing, housing safety, and accountability. Patricia Boudreau, 2008, Nova Scotia. On February 27, 2008, police in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, received a call that immediately put the town on edge. A 12-year-old girl named Carissa Boudreau hadn't come home. Her mother, Patricia Boudreau, told officers that Karissa had gone out earlier in the day and never returned. In a community like Bridgewater, missing children don't fade quietly into the background. Word spread fast. Neighbors stepped outside. Parents paused their routines. Within hours, volunteers were walking roadsides, checking wooded paths, and calling Carissa's name into the cold evening air. Flyers appeared on poles and storefront windows. Police began canvassing, asking the same question everywhere they went. Who saw Karissa last? The answer, again and again, was the same. Her mother. Boudreau spoke publicly in the days that followed. She described Karissa as outgoing, friendly, and deeply loved. She appealed directly to anyone who might know something, asking them to come forward. Vigils were organized. Candles burned through the night. Flowers and stuffed animals gathered near the family home. To most people watching, Penny looked like a parent in pain. The town responded with empathy. Strangers offered hugs. Searchers gave their time. Everyone wanted the same thing, for Karissa to be found alive. Behind the scenes, investigators were listening carefully. From the outset, police noted inconsistencies in Penny's account of Carissa's last movements. The details were small, but they mattered. Time shifted. Reasons changed. Her description of where Karissa went and why didn't always line up. Detectives also began learning more about the home itself. Friends and relatives described a relationship between mother and daughter that had grown tense. Arguments were frequent. Discipline issues had escalated. The weeks leading up to Carissa's disappearance were marked by conflict, not calm. None of this proved a crime on its own, but together it gave investigators reason to dig deeper. especially since no independent witness could place Karissa anywhere after she was last seen with Penny. 5 days later, on March 2, 2008, the search ended in the worst possible way. Police officers searching a wooded area near the La Have River, close to Maitland Bridge, discovered human remains. The location was not far from Bridgewater, but secluded enough to avoid casual discovery. Dental records confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Carissa Boudreau. The case immediately shifted from a missing child investigation to a homicide. Autopsy results later revealed that Karissa had been killed with a firearm and buried in a shallow grave. There was no evidence of an abduction by a stranger, no sign of a struggle at the burial site. What investigators saw instead suggested planning and familiarity with the area. Once Karissa was found, police began reconstructing the days surrounding her disappearance with forensic precision. They focused on a .22 caliber rifle that Penny Boudreau had access to. Ballistics testing linked the weapon to Carissa's death. Phone records, vehicle data, and witness statements placed Penny in the vicinity of the burial site during the relevant time frame. The location itself was significant. It wasn't random. It was an area Penny knew. As the evidence came together, investigators concluded that Penny had killed Karissa and then transported her body to the wooded area near the river before reporting her daughter missing. What made the case especially unsettling wasn't just the act itself. It was what followed. After Karissa was already gone, Penny actively participated in the search efforts. She stood beside volunteers. She accepted condolences. She spoke to media. She watched candlelight vigils held in Carissa's name. All the while, she knew where her daughter was. This was not confusion or panic in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy. It was a sustained effort to mislead police and the public, built on grief and trust. Investigators later testified that this behavior weighed heavily in their understanding of intent. On March 14, 2008, Penny Patricia Boudreau was arrested. She was charged with second-degree murder in the death of her daughter. Under Canadian law, second-degree murder applies when a killing is intentional but does not meet the specific criteria for first-degree murder, such as p. Rovin planning and deliberation beyond a reasonable doubt. The charge still carries the most serious penalties available outside of first-degree murder. The woman who had been at the center of the town's collective sympathy was now facing life-altering consequences. Penny's trial took place in 2010 and drew national attention. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case. They presented forensic evidence linking the rifle to Carissa's death, testimony establishing Penny's movements, and expert analysis explaining how the burial site fit into the timeline. Witnesses described the strained relationship between mother and daughter and the escalating tension inside the home. The Crown argued that Penny killed Karissa and then staged a disappearance to buy time and deflect suspicion. The defense challenged the interpretation of the evidence and questioned aspects of the timeline, but they struggled to overcome the weight of the forensic and circumstantial proof. After deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Penny Patricia Boudreau was found guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with eligibility to apply for parole after 15 years, as required by Canadian law. A life sentence means she will remain under correctional supervision for the rest of her life, regardless of any future release. She was transferred to a federal penitentiary, where she continues to serve her sentence. The reaction in Nova Scotia was one of disbelief and anger. Many people struggled to accept that the person they had comforted during the search had been responsible all along. Vigils that once symbolized hope became reminders of how deeply the community had been misled. For parents across the province, the case left a lasting mark. The murder of Carissa Boudreau remains one of the most disturbing family homicide cases in Canadian history, not because of unanswered questions, but because the truth emerged so clearly. A child trusted the person responsible for her care. A disappearance was staged to draw sympathy. An entire community was pulled into a lie built on grief and urgency. There was no dramatic confession or sudden collapse of the story. Instead, the truth surfaced through evidence, timelines, and patient investigation. Each new detail sharpened the reality of what had happened. What makes this case especially difficult to process is the contrast between appearance and reality. Penny Boudreau didn't flee or isolate herself. She stood in plain sight, surrounded by people who believed her pain was genuine. All the while, she knew exactly where her daughter was. Carissa Boudreau was 12 years old. Her life ended far too soon, and her name remains etched into Canadian true crime history. Not as a mystery left unsolved, but as a reminder of how betrayal can sometimes come from the closest place of all. Tooba Mohammad Yahya, Ontario, 2009. On June 30, 2009, a passing motorist noticed something unusual in the Rideau Canal, just outside Kingston, Ontario. A car sat partially submerged near a set of locks, its rear end visible above the waterline. At first glance, it looked like a tragic driving mishap, the kind of accident that can happen late at night on unfamiliar roads. But as police and divers worked to recover the vehicle, it became clear that this scene didn't line up with an ordinary crash. Inside the car were 4 bodies. They were identified as Zainab Shafia, 19, Sahar Shafia, 17, Geeti Shafia, 13, and Rona Amir Mohammad, 52, the first wife of Mohammad Shafia and a woman who had lived for years in a position of isolation within the family. From the moment the identities were confirmed, the case shifted from a possible accident to a full homicide investigation. The Shafia family lived in Montreal, Quebec, where Mohammad Shafia was a wealthy real estate developer. His second wife, Tooba Mohammad Yahya, was often described publicly as quiet, traditional, and reserved. To outsiders, she appeared to play a secondary role in a household dominated by her husband. Behind closed doors, however, family dynamics were strained. Court testimony later revealed long-standing conflicts between the parents and their daughters. The girls were pushing for independence, forming friendships outside their community, and adopting lifestyles their parents disapproved of. Arguments were frequent. Tensions escalated over several years, leaving a documented trail of threats, complaints, and fear. Rona Amir Mohammad, the first wife, lived separately in a small apartment provided by the family. She was financially dependent and socially isolated, and increasingly seen as a burden. On the night of June 29, 2009, the Shafia family traveled toward Kingston under the pretense of resolving property matters. According to evidence presented at trial, the victims were last seen alive in the company of family members. Sometime overnight, the 4 victims ended up inside a Nissan Sentra, which was later found in the canal. The vehicle had no signs of accidental entry into the water. There were no skid marks, no indications of panic braking, and no mechanical failure. The positioning of the car raised immediate red flags. When autopsies were conducted, they revealed that the victims did not die from drowning. Instead, they had been killed before the car entered the water. This single fact dismantled the family's initial explanation almost instantly. In the days following the discovery, Mohammad Shafia told police the deaths were a tragic accident. He suggested that the women had driven into the canal unintentionally while traveling at night. Tooba Mohammad Yahya supported this narrative, but investigators weren't convinced. The physical evidence didn't match the story, and neither did the family's behavior after the incident. Phone records, vehicle movements, and witness statements revealed inconsistencies that could not be ignored. As detectives dug deeper, a far more disturbing picture began to emerge. Police uncovered evidence that the killings were planned in advance. GPS data placed the family's vehicles in the area multiple times before the deaths. Tools linked to the crime were found. There were recorded statements from family members expressing intense anger toward the girls, using language that framed them as sources of embarrassment and dishonor. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence came from wiretap recordings. In conversations captured after the deaths, both Mohammad Shafia and Tooba Mohammad Yahya made remarks that prosecutors argued showed knowledge and approval of what had happened. Tooba's words in particular stood out. Rather than expressing shock or grief, her statements reflected satisfaction and justification. This directly contradicted the image of a powerless spouse acting under coercion. Throughout the investigation and trial, Tooba Mohammad Yahya's role became a central focus. The defense attempted to portray her as submissive, controlled, and fearful, a woman simply following her husband's orders. Prosecutors rejected that narrative outright. Evidence. They showed Tooba participated in planning discussions, was present during key moments leading up to the deaths, and helped maintain the false accident story afterward. Her actions were deliberate and coordinated, not passive. The court ultimately concluded that Tooba was not a bystander. She was an active participant. The trial began in 2011 and drew international attention. It lasted several months and included testimony from police investigators, forensic experts, family members, and cultural specialists. The prosecution laid out a methodical case, emphasizing motive, planning, and execution. They argued that the killings were carried out to restore what the perpetrators believed was lost honor. The defense challenged the interpretation of evidence, but struggled to counter the overwhelming documentation of intent. In January 2012, the jury delivered its verdict. Tooba, Mohammad Yahya, Mohammad Shafia, and Hamid Shafia were each found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced all 3 to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. In sentencing remarks, the court made it clear that cultural explanations did not excuse or lessen responsibility. The law applied equally, and the actions taken were intentional and unforgivable. Tooba was transferred to a federal penitentiary, where she remains incarcerated. Public response across Canada was immediate and intense. Vigils were held for the victims, and the case sparked national conversations about family violence, protection of vulnerable youth, and the warning signs that had been missed. For many, the most unsettling aspect was how clearly the killings could have been prevented, had earlier concerns been taken seriously. The Shafia family murders are essential to understanding modern Canadian crime for one key reason. They dismantle the assumption that women involved in family killings are always acting under pressure or fear. Tooba Mohammad Yahya was not invisible. She was not silent. She was not coerced into compliance. She participated. The evidence showed calculation, alignment with motive, and conscious effort to deceive investigators afterward. Her conviction confirmed that accountability does not depend on gender or perceived power within a household. 4 lives were taken, 3 young girls and a woman who had long lived under control and isolation. The crime was not spontaneous. It was deliberate, planned, and carried out with chilling resolve. More than a decade later, the case remains one of the most significant and disturbing family murder cases in Canadian history, not just because of how it ended, but because of how clearly it exposed what can happen when control, entitlement, and silence intersect. Melanie Alex, late 1990s and early 2000s, Quebec. When fires turn deadly, they're often explained as accidents, faulty wiring, old appliances, a moment of carelessness. That assumption followed the first blaze connected to Melanie Alex. At the time, no one suspected they were looking at the beginning of a pattern that would later leave 2 family members dead and lead to a life sentence in federal prison. The first fire occurred in the late 1990s in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec, a quiet city south of Montreal. The victim was Francine Levesque, Melanie Alex's mother. Francine used a wheelchair and required assistance to move around the home. When the fire broke out, she was unable to escape. Emergency responders arrived, but it was too late. Francine died from smoke inhalation. Investigators examined the scene and, based on the information available at the time, the fire was classified as accidental. No criminal charges were laid. The file was closed. For several years, that conclusion stood. Everything changed a few years later. On May 12, 2003, firefighters were called to another house fire, this time at Melanie Alex's own residence. Inside the home was her 1-year-old son, Matisse Alix LeBlanc. First responders attempted life-saving measures, but the child did not survive. Unlike the earlier fire, this scene raised immediate concerns. Fire investigators noticed something that does not typically appear in accidental blazes. More than one point where the fire appeared to have started. Fires caused by household malfunctions usually spread outward from a single source. This one did not. The burn pattern suggested the flames had been introduced deliberately in different areas. That detail alone was enough to shift the investigation into a criminal direction. Quebec provincial police investigators took over the case and began reconstructing the timeline leading up to Tanmao. Fire. They examined Melanie Alex's movements, statements, and behavior before and after the incident. At the same time, investigators reopened the earlier file involving her mother's death. With advances in fire analysis, techniques, and the context of a second fatal blaze, the first fire was re-examined. Investigators identified similarities between the two scenes, not just in the outcome, but in how the fires behaved. Both showed indicators inconsistent with accidental ignition. What had once been viewed as an isolated tragedy now appeared connected to a second, far more suspicious event. Just days after the 2003 fire, Melanie Alex was arrested. She was charged in connection with her son's death and later faced charges related to the earlier fire that killed her mother. The prosecution's case did not rely on speculation or emotional arguments. Instead, it focused on forensic evidence, expert testimony, and a clear sequence of events. Fire investigators explained how multiple ignition points are identified and why they matter. These patterns don't happen by chance. They require time, intent, and control, especially inside a private residence. The case moved toward trial. During the trial, Melanie Alex took the stand in her own defense. She denied responsibility for both fires and suggested alternative explanations. The defense attempted to raise doubt about timelines and questioned whether the forensic conclusions were definitive. Prosecutors responded with methodical precision. Expert witnesses walked the jury through each fire scene, explaining how burn patterns, smoke damage, and fire spread were analyzed. They demonstrated how both fires shared structural similarities that pointed to deliberate ignition rather than coincidence. The jury also heard how the second fire forced investigators to revisit the first. Viewed together, the two incidents formed a pattern that could not reasonably be ignored. This was not about a single moment gone wrong. It was about repeated actions producing the same deadly result. In 2005, the jury delivered its decision. Melanie Alex was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for the death of her mother and one for the death of her son. She was also convicted of arson related to both fires. Under Canadian law, first-degree murder carries a mandatory life sentence, with eligibility to apply for parole after 25 years. The judge imposed that sentence, sending Alix to federal prison. She remains incarcerated today. The verdict sent shockwaves through Quebec. News coverage focused heavily on the unsettling reality that 2 family members had died in fires that were initially believed to be accidents. Many questioned how often early conclusions might prevent deeper scrutiny in similar cases. There was also widespread disbelief that a mother could be found legally responsible for the death of her own child through such calculated means. What makes the Melanie Alex case particularly difficult to process is not chaos or emotional outbursts. There was no sudden confrontation, no public struggle, no visible warning signs that neighbors could point to afterward. Instead, the evidence presented at trial described controlled actions carried out in private spaces, using fire as the mechanism. Fires don't leave fingerprints in the traditional sense. They erase, consume, and destroy, which is why they can be mistaken for accidents when examined in isolation. In this case, it took 2 deaths for the pattern to emerge. The victims were not strangers. They were people dependent on care and protection. One was physically vulnerable. The other was just beginning life. That is why the Melanie Alex case remains one of the most disturbing arson-related murder cases in Canadian history, not because of spectacle, but because of its quiet precision and the time it took for the truth to surface. The cases in this documentary aren't connected by location, background, or circumstance. What links them is something quieter, how easily violence can exist behind normal routines, familiar roles, and trusted faces. None of these stories were obvious at first. In most of them, warning signs were missed, explanations were accepted too quickly, and assumptions filled the gaps. By the time the truth came out, the damage was already done. If there's one thing these cases show, It's that crime doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Which case in this video affected you the most, and why? Do you think any of these outcomes could have been prevented? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this documentary informative and well-researched, consider subscribing. More long-form true crime stories like this are on the way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.